The right amount is 0. I'm not saying it's evil. I'm not making a moral judgment. I'm not saying never. When you're a grown-up, you'll do what you want. Delay initiation, as you said before. It is not the same to say that a mature adult should not be restricted from having a little alcohol or cannabis. It is not the same as to say that young people should have access because they get into trouble.
Ben Esra Çavuşoğlu. 18 yıldır ayık bir hayat yaşıyorum. Bağımlılık hastalığıyla mücadelem, beni beden ve zihin performansımı iyileştirmek, hayat kalitemi arttırmak, daha sağlıklı ve uzun yaşamak için yeni yöntemler, cihazlar ve takviye ürünler araştırmaya yönlendirdi. Bağımlılık hastalığı, biohacking ve longevity alanlarındaki kendi deneyimlerimden dünyadaki son gelişmelere, çığır açan girişimcilerden uzman akademisyenlere, yıllardır yaptığım sohbetler artık her hafta Ayık Kafa podcast'te. So we have Marc Fishman here. He's an addiction psychiatrist and one of the deputy editor of ASAM, which is the American Society of Addiction Medicine, which is the treatment criteria for addictive substance-related and co-occurring conditions, correct? Also, he's a faculty of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. And last but not least, he's the clinical director of his own rehab treatment center, correct?
Correct.
Welcome, Marc.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a treat to be here.
Thank you, Marc. We go back a long way.
That's right.
Marc was in this dream team when we were building the rehab center in Antep. And he had many funny stories, but I would like to start saying this one joke. Actually, it wasn't a joke, but there, you know where I'm going with that. We were treating street kids and they were for months maybe without showering. And one of the staff member, she was the operation manager, and she came to you and she says like, these kids are stinking. And your reply was, why don't you use a soap or some soap? So, do you remember that?
I do remember. And the emphasis is, let's be practical. Let's do what we can in ways everybody can understand. We don't need highfalutin solutions to simple problems.
Exactly. Marc, the reason I wanted to do this program with you, because first of all, you're an addiction psychiatrist and your specialty is in adolescent mostly. Am I correct?
That's right. I treat individuals across the lifespan of all ages, but I have a special interest in young people, adolescents and young adults, both because they're so much fun and so rich to work with, but also, as in any chronic relapsing remitting illness, the earlier you intervene, the more you can bend the course, the more you can prevent progression before things get to their most advanced malignant stage later in life.
Okay, that's great. That's a wonderful approach. So, you know, today's topic is going to be about marijuana, cannabis smoking. Since I started the program, this podcast, and started also sharing my journey and also sharing what's the correct type of treatment and what family can do, what individual can do about themselves, I am getting a lot of questions about these young adults or adolescents are using smoking pot. Families are very, very concerned about that. And even more so because it's legal in most part of the world, that it's very difficult to explain to these kids, I want to say, that it's going to be very dangerous for their brain, for their mental capacity, and in the long run, maybe making them stuck in some sort of a mental illness. Including, I was able to firsthand deal with a young man that when he came to me, he had a severe psychosis. Then I was able to work with him and send him away to a rehab center. Then we saw that actually that psychosis was from the smoking and not with anything underlying. So help us, help families to first explain the problem and what it can cause, and help them maybe how to deal with this issue.
No, it's so true. The problem of cannabis is an international, worldwide problem. I deal with it every day in my clinical and research work here in the U.S., but there's no country, no culture that is spared this increasing problem. And as you put it exactly right, part of the issue is a inappropriate and inaccurate decreased perception of harm. The notion that cannabis, weed, what's the big deal? It's no big deal. And of course, that's an issue for young people. And it's very much an issue for us adults, as parents, as caretakers, as policymakers, as people who guide the conversation as caretakers for the next generation. And I think it's important to talk about approaches that can be digestible and can reach young people in terms of what they might be motivated by, and then perhaps a different set of messages and scientific information that might be appropriate for parents and caretakers, because there'll be slightly different audiences. So you mentioned the risk of cannabis associated psychosis, and we can talk at some depth about that because there's a great deal of research that is increasingly showing that link, and it is a very strong and dangerous link. I'm not sure that's going to dissuade a 13-year-old. It's like when you tell a 13-year-old, don't smoke cigarettes because you can get lung cancer in 40 years. Well, it's true, but it's not going to change the imagination of a 13-year-old. That's not the way the 13-year-old mind and brain works. When I want to talk to a 13-year-old about cigarette smoking, I say, don't smoke cigarettes because it'll make your breath stink and no one will want to kiss you. That's a different kind of conversation for a young person than it would be for their parents, for policy, for teachers, for counselors. But the counselors need to know about the lung cancer in 40 years because those are the things that we are concerned with as stewards and caretakers for the next generation. Everybody says, we did it when we were kids. That is the adults. We did it when we were kids. It's no big deal. Everybody does it. It's not really a drug anyway. It's legal. It's medicine. So let's break that down. One of the things that people say, and the kids say this too, is everybody's doing it. Well, a lot of people are doing it, but not everybody. And so that's point number one. Maybe everybody you know, talking to a young person now, is doing it because of the peer cohort that you associate with, and people tend to aggregate in terms of behaviors and lifestyle for their peers. But the data suggests that whereas maybe half or a third, depending on what country, what culture, which population, of 18-year-olds may have had lifetime exposure to cannabis, which is a lot. That's not 100%. Half or two-thirds, depending on where you are and who's doing the measurement, of 18-year-olds have never in their lifetimes had alcohol or cannabis or nicotine. So it's very interesting. It isn't everybody. Now, but it is a lot. And because it's increasingly legal, as you say, or in some places there are thoughts, exaggerated thoughts in my mind, about medical use, that decreases perceptions of harm. If doctors are doing it, if the law allows it, it must be no big deal. And we see how this goes in the U.S. opioid epidemic from starting 2 decades ago. As it became more and more common as a medical intervention, that led to lots of people, including young people, saying, well, if doctors can prescribe it, then it's no big deal. If it's in grandma's nest, it must be okay. So we know that by analogy. Another analogy is to alcohol. We know alcohol is legal. We know many people use alcohol without harm. In fact, most mature adults, not the same as adolescents, that's very different in terms of vulnerability, but most mature adults can drink alcohol sporadically, occasionally, a glass of wine with dinner, take it or leave it, without losing control, without increasing their frequency of use, without getting to compulsive use, and without getting to impairment and use disorder. The same, by the way, is true for cannabis. And one of the reasons why internationally there has been a decrease in restrictions to access is to reflect that fact that most people don't get into trouble. Mature adults, you could argue, should have access without over-punitivization that has led to draconian harms in the past. But that doesn't reflect the experience of some people, not the majority, but a substantial minority, even among mature adults, but a much larger substantial proportion among young people. So just to reflect on that, if 20%-ish of adult drinkers get into trouble with drinking, that means 80% don't, so it's a minority, but it's still a substantial number. The number's probably similar in cannabis for mature adults, 10%, 15%, 20%. But it might be twice or three times that rate for vulnerable adolescents. So one of the messages that we have to stress again and again to the parental caretakers, to the teachers, to the policymakers is that adolescents are vulnerable. They're different. There are developmental vulnerabilities having to do with the immaturity of adolescent mind, brain, spirit, social connection, all of those developing issues in which we know they are not mature. They don't have the full set of resiliencies and coping skills. So they are more vulnerable. It is not the same to say that a mature adult should not be restricted from having a little alcohol or cannabis. It is not the same as to say that young people should have access because they get into trouble.
I would like you to give me more details when you say vulnerable, because their brain didn't get developed fully, or they may have an underlying issues.
Lessons from emerging neuroscience, for example, and from psychology show us that the cognitive faculties and the emotional regulation faculties, which you can measure in the psychology laboratory, for adolescents are significantly immature and underdeveloped compared to older adults. And as we understand how some of those psychological phenomena are linked to brain development, both at the macro level of brain structure and the micro level of neuron circuitry and interconnectivity, we also see that lack of maturity. So one simple rule of thumb is to kind of think about the normal arc of development of the adolescent brain associated with adolescent thinking and adolescent emotional regulation. That normal arc means that adolescents are not fully baked, if you will, ready to come out of the oven and be independent, fully mature, autonomous adults well into the third decade of life, maybe 25, maybe 24, 26, whatever. But on average, that's a problem. And for some adolescents who are particularly vulnerable, that may be even longer to maturation. And it is those that are particularly vulnerable, and parents might identify them as the folks that even as toddlers have psychological vulnerability because their emotion regulation, their executive function, their decision making, their future orientation, their ability to tolerate frustration is less than average. You ask any mom who's had more than one kid, yeah, that kid was a little different. He was the tantruming one. He was the one who was sensitive in their emotions. He was the one that need more consolation, that had more difficulty with change. That's a vulnerable young person in particular. But all young people are vulnerable in comparison to older, mature adults.
So what happens when they start smoking, let's say, at the age of 15, to their brain?
We don't know enough to be able to say what the direct brain changes of cannabis are. There's exciting work being done, a lot of it being done, unfortunately, with little mousies and little hamsters. We shy away from slicing open the brains of our young children, but as we're learning, we see that there are changes in the development of brain circuitry, of the connectivity of neurons, of the mature transmission of the chemical messengers of brain transmission, of the adequate regulation of the reward and reinforcement system deep in the brain, regulated by the neurotransmitter that many people may have heard of, dopamine. But we don't yet know enough how the actual architecture goes. We have some experiments in rats where we see that exposure to cannabis prior to the birth, that is exposure to a pregnant rat and exposure to the unborn rat fetus, can lead to vulnerability later after the rat is born in terms of behavioral dysregulation and in terms of more vulnerability to both nicotine preference and cocaine preference. So we know there are some brain changes, but it's hard for us to nail them down. But what we do know...
So hold on, that's an interesting message to young parents, actually. If they are smoking, if their partner is smoking, or their friends are smoking, or doing any other drugs, and if the pregnant person is facing that chemical, that may affect the unborn child.
Mike, I don't want to exaggerate the risk because we haven't fully demonstrated that in humans, but I agree it's a good caution. It's like there is no safe amount of alcohol in pregnancy. We caution pregnant mothers to limit their exposure. You're absolutely right. Why not be safe? The thing that we are most concerned about in terms of the risk to adolescents, and we'll get into psychiatric consequences like cannabis-associated psychosis. Very interesting. But the thing that is most concerning to us is the increased proportion from experimental initiation. Adolescents get into mischief. Adolescents try stuff. We know that. But the reason it's so important is because a substantial minority of them, higher than in mature adults, go from that normative experimentation, usual adolescent mischief, they get into stuff. They go from that to increasing frequency, to loss of control, to development of problems, and meeting criteria for a use disorder. So the progression from first initiation to development of a cannabis use disorder is alarming. I don't mean to exaggerate. It's not everybody. It's not the majority. But just some recent data from the States, within 1 year of initiation of cannabis, adolescents under the age of 18 have a 10% rate of cannabis use disorder, just within 1 short year. Within 3 years of first initiation, just trying it, 20% develop a use disorder.
So we're talking about occasional smoking, let's say every weekend when they meet up with their friends, but 3 consecutive years they're smoking one way or the other.
That's right. And they're smoking more. Not all of them, but by 3 years, 20% of them. And over a higher duration of time, some estimates are that that number gets as high as 40%. So just initiating use in adolescence might confer a 40% risk of developing a use disorder. As you say, going from occasional use once a month to weekly to more than weekly and to problems as might be with any substance use disorder, trouble with academics, with school, with social connection, with developing depression, with losing a sense of interest in usual activities and narrowing their repertoire of usual activities. And that's a core feature of a substance use disorder, and certainly a typical feature of cannabis use disorder, that the ability for young people to be open to broad, rich experience diminishes. The arc of the world, the lens of the world narrows. The technical term we use in psychiatry is anhedonia. That is losing hedonic capacity or losing the capacity for enrichment and pleasure. And in large part with cannabis and with other substances, that's because these substances of intoxication act as sledgehammers, if you will, and overpower and hijack the brain's normal reward system as mediated by the dopamine neurotransmitter and others. And so the only button that they can push as they increasingly have a gap between the reinforcement of cannabis and the pleasure of cannabis, other things fade. Family, love, homework, work, sports, those things fade, cannabis ascends, and it becomes the only way that they can push that button of brain reinforcement. And that's part of the natural progression of a substance use disorder, including a cannabis use disorder. And it gives us insight for substance use disorders as to how addiction can be linked to depression. because anhedonia also is a hallmark of the illness major depression, and there's lots of overlap in terms of the mechanism. So we know, for example, now talking about psychiatric consequences, that cannabis use and cannabis use disorders in adolescents increases risk of depression and other mood disorders like anxiety, etc.
Is there a difference? I know there is, but maybe you can also help the audience to understand, because there are many parents also, like there are some parents or some families are concerned, and there are others, oh, what about it? We smoked as well. But today's cannabis is much different than 30 years ago. It's chemically played, it's much stronger. The potency makes the difference. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's such an important point. But you're absolutely right. Lots of parents say it's no big deal. We did it when we were kids. We lived. We never died of an overdose from cannabis. A couple of points about that. One is that just because you took a gamble and won doesn't mean that your kids have to make the same mistake. We want better for the next generation. Number two, I think parents have a misguided sense of hypocrisy. How dare I'm not comfortable saying they shouldn't do it if I did it. No. Again, we all make mistakes. It's part of growing up. But what we need to do as parents is try to shelter the next generation from harm. If you drove in a car without a seatbelt when you were younger, that doesn't mean you can't tell your kid to please wear a seatbelt or to wear a helmet when they ride the motorcycle or the bicycle. It's still the healthful thing to do. It's not a moral hypocrisy. It's just what we as parents do to try to guide healthful behaviors. The third thing, and it's exactly as you said, it's not the same drug anymore. 30 years ago, for me, 60 years ago, when we were kids, it was a very different drug. So over time, the same geniuses who have given us high protein miracle rice through breeding and selective plant genetics and hydroponics and all these things have done the same kind of thing to increase the THC content of plant cannabis. And so we have seen over the last 30 years a 8 to 20-fold increase in the THC content of plant cannabis. Remember, THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, is the active intoxicating ingredient in cannabis, what people seek it for. It's what makes you high, but it's also the toxic substance that gives you brain changes, that causes addiction, that can lead to psychosis and depression. And the rates have gone up and up and up. So it's not your grandfather's little skinny reefer. It's a 10 or 20-fold increased potency. And the way that kids are imbibing it now are in much different ways. In fat cigars, in wax concentrates, in e-cigarette formulations. So the doses they're getting are much more dangerous.
Can you give a little bit more information about the potency? What does it do? Why it's important?
A nice example is to alcohol. If you think about the historical change in the addiction risk of alcohol, when alcohol first became common 15,000 years ago because somebody left some grain out in the rain and it got naturally fermented, maximum alcohol content potency was 3% with naturally occurring accidental beer. Over time, human technology has been able to increase the alcohol potency. And in the 16 and 1700s, with the invention of liquor distillation, we were able to get to 40% alcohol with liquor. It's not that you can't develop an alcohol use disorder with 3% beer. You can, but you got to use an awful lot to get the same intoxicating effect. If you go from 3% to 40%, it's much easier to get the toxic effects. It's much easier to get the reinforcing effect. It's much easier to form a habit, get out of control. And we see as potency increases, both with cannabis, from 3% to 20%, with alcohol from 3% to 40%, or the difference between powdered cocaine and crack cocaine, as digestion and access and as potency increases, toxicity and addiction risk increases. And you can see in alcohol, the rates of cirrhosis go up with the advent of distillation, the rates of addiction go up. And the same now is true of cannabis. We are also seeing, I mentioned access. As it is legalized, we've got a natural experiment across the world, in the US and other places, where we see as restrictions decrease. You might argue that mature adults, their liberties are increased. Maybe, maybe not. But for young people, increased access means more initiate and more progress, and we have higher rates of trouble.
Correct me if I'm wrong. With the higher potency of THC product, the risk of psychiatric disorders also rise, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So let's talk about psychiatric disorders. The evidence that we are now seeing for psychiatric consequences of cannabis lead us to three areas of concern. Psychosis is where the data is the strongest. So we'll talk about that. Mm-hmm. But depression, we also have very good emerging and strengthening evidence, and cognitive impairment. Mm-hmm. That evidence is relatively new, not as clear, but it's pretty scary. Let's talk about psychosis first. Absolutely clear evidence now from multiple countries across multiple cultures linking cannabis initiation and regular cannabis use, mm-hmm. and in a dose-dependent fashion, the higher the dose, the higher the harm, to new initiation of psychosis. So it's the minority. Most people who use, it's not one puff and you start hallucinating. Most people don't get that, but a significant minority do. And in early studies, one of the landmark studies was a 10-year longitudinal study coming out of Germany, but it's now been everywhere. We see in those early studies a twofold increase in risk. Mm-hmm. That is, those who had never used cannabis and then initiated cannabis doubled their risk of later developing a psychotic episode. Those who had been using and had psychosis previously doubled their risk of continuation of psychosis. But in further studies internationally with high potency and frequent use, that risk factor is perhaps as high as 6. So a 6-fold increase with high frequency, high potency cannabis use, 6-fold increase in the rate of psychosis. Again, it's still the minority, but a 6-fold increase, that frightens me a lot. What we sometimes see, a single episode mm-hmm. that will resolve if the person stops smoking. The problem is many of people don't stop smoking. But unfortunately, and in a totally unpredictable fashion, could be early on in a person's using career, it could be later on with an experienced smoker. There's no such thing as, oh, I can handle it, it won't happen to me. It's totally unpredictable. Some cases of cannabis-associated psychosis do not resolve, even with abstinence, even with stopping. And those individuals, especially common in adolescents and young adults, those individuals may go on to develop a full syndrome of schizophrenia, which is, of course, terrifying and should be very scary.
These people had a predisposition, whether from their first-hand relatives or...
Great question.
Or it's just through the marijuana.
It's a great question. We think the answer is yes and yes. It is probably an increased risk in those who have a strong family history of psychotic illness, especially mm-hmm. schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. But the risk is still considerable even without that family history risk. So we have seen in these studies, they control for family history of schizophrenia and other psychosis, and the risk increase twofold, as I said, in mm-hmm. one study, 6-fold in more modern studies with high potency. Those risks persist even when you control for family history. So yes, those with family history need to be cautious, but everybody should be cautious because it can strike anywhere. We don't really understand what the biochemical mechanism is, but we are clearly seeing in these epidemiological studies that it is a major risk factor.
It's like a Russian roulette. I mean, it's crazy. It's almost like whether you smoke cannabis or do methamphetamine, it's kind of no different what I'm hearing from you.
Well, methamphetamine probably has even a higher risk.
Of course. But what I was trying to make a comparison such as like...
Can happen either way.
Yeah, alcohol, cocaine, whatever. They have lesser tendency to turn into a psychiatric illness.
But it's still significant. It's like the kids say to me, Dr. Fishman, why are you bothering me when you say I shouldn't drive while I'm smoking? It's not as bad as alcohol. Well, okay, but are there only two doors? You can only either drive buzzed or drive drunk. What about driving sober? Had you considered that? So, yes, the risk of a motor vehicle crash with alcohol is increased by 6 to 10-fold over being sober. And the risk of a motor vehicle crash with cannabis only is 2 to 4 times being sober. But still 2 to 4 times. Maybe it's better or less bad. It's not better. Maybe it's less bad, but I still don't want to be driving next to that guy.
Yeah.
So it's, again, these comparisons. Yeah, maybe one is worse, one is better, but both are still problematic. There's interesting data, back to the schizophrenia thing, there's interesting data now coming out of Denmark. The Scandinavian countries keep these incredibly minute and very careful population tracking census data, so you can sometimes see this epidemiological data. In Denmark, we have seen a 4-fold increase in the rate of schizophrenia over the past 30 or 40 years, and it correlates with the increased potency of cannabis. The risk of cannabis-associated schizophrenia, especially in young adult males, has gone up over 30 years by 4-fold. You can't prove this causally. It's still correlation, but it's still very persuasive. One estimate tells us that 30% of young adult male cases of schizophrenia in Denmark may have been preventable by eliminating or reducing cannabis use disorder. That's, to me, very frightening.
We gave enough fear now. Let's talk about the solution a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's say 2 different persona. One is experiencing currently some psychiatric illness, mostly, let's say, mood disorder or schizophrenia. And the other one, smoking, not having psychiatric issues, but, getting into trouble, not enjoying life, whatever they're experiencing. And there are 2 sets of parents. What do they need to do?
You're so right. We need to get to the parents, and we need to encourage and coach and empower the parents that they can set a standard for what is appropriate behavior in my household, among my children, as I'm trying to coach and teach you, as you would about anything. We're not naive enough to think that just because we say it, either me as a doctor or someone as a parent or as a coach or as a teacher, just because I say it, they will do it. But remember that our voices are the voices that carry in their heads. We are the voices that they remember and they come back to. And our attitudes and our guidance are so important. So we can say, this is bad for you. The right amount is 0. Nobody under 18, nobody under 21 should initiate. I'm not saying it's evil. I'm not making a moral judgment. I'm not saying never. When you're a grown-up, you'll do what you want. But delay initiation, as you said before. No one under 18, no one under 21. These are the rules in my house. If your friends come here and do this, they are not welcome. I want to know where you're going. If you're with friends that are doing this, that's inappropriate. I want to talk to their parents. I want to create a zone of health around you. No different than talking about seatbelts or wear a condom or don't smoke cigarettes or look both ways when crossing the street. All of these are health guidance that we give to the next generation. And we do it trying not to be punitive, trying not to be too shrill, just this is what I'm asking for you. Now, does that mean they'll do it? No. And when, not always, and when they stumble and fall and get into some trouble, hopefully you know it early, and you encourage them to talk about it. Come tell me. I won't bite your head off. We'll debrief, and I'll try to help encourage you to do better, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and let's move on. How can we prevent harms? That's what we do as parents. It's difficult, but we've got to get the parents to be able to take a stand, to not be hopeless. There's nothing I can do. There's a lot you can do. So that's number one. Then we ought to get to other adolescent-facing professionals. Where are the points of interaction where young people are getting guidance? Is it in the family doctor? Then the family doctor needs to talk about this early, before they've started. Is it with the clergy, where they're getting advices in religious groups, in the mosque, wherever? Let's talk about it. Is it in youth clubs? Is it sports coaches? Is it teachers? All the places where adolescents are getting information and getting counseling, those professionals should be empowered to have these conversations, not but in a productive, health-oriented message about, we want better for you. And then, thirdly, we want to begin teaching people about how to have a conversation with a young person. Because just telling a young person about health problems, as I said about cigarette smoking, this 30 years, that's not going to happen to me. What are you talking about? Everybody does it. Leave me alone. So you want to develop a way of engaging with young people, not lecturing them, not trying to scare them off, but to engage them about what is important in their lives and see about helping connect the dots between things that may be going well, associated with broad social interaction that doesn't involve intoxication, and emphasizing their strengths, but then also connecting the dots between what's not going well and where they've gotten into harms from intoxication. I'm not doing as well in school. I'm not seeing my friends as much. The kids I'm hanging out with are getting me into behaviors that will get me in trouble with the law. Whatever it is, do you see how that might be linked to cannabis use? Nah, what are you talking about? That? All right, but let's continue to talk about it and learn about it. One of the conversations I like to have with young people is, all right, you tell me you're only using a little bit, or you can handle it fine, or you're not using more than your friends, or everybody's doing it. I'm not having a trouble. It's no big deal. Shut up, Dr. Fishman. Okay, we'll agree to disagree. But surely you know someone, maybe not you, but you know someone who's been in trouble with cannabis. Is there anybody you know? An older brother, a cousin, the boyfriend of your cousin's friend who smokes too much, that's been in trouble? What do you mean? What's too much? Why are they in trouble? Why do you make that connection? Not about you, about them. And you see what I've done there is, I may not be on the same page, but maybe I'm in the same book. I'm having a conversation that establishes there is such a thing as too much, that there are harms from cannabis, but I've reduced their defensiveness. I'm not blaming them or accusing them of problem. We're having an abstract conversation about somebody else, but then at least we can establish what is a line. All right, let's talk about you. Can you think of an alternate strand of the multiverse in which maybe it could be too much? I know you don't think you'd ever do that, but what would be too much? You say you only smoke on the weekends. Would it be a problem if you smoked on Wednesdays? You say you only smoke after school, after your homework is done. Would it be a problem if you smoked at school or before school? You say you only smoke with your buddies occasionally. Would it be a problem if you smoked alone? And then again, we're having a conversation about what is the line? What's too much? Why would it be a problem? And then that gives me fuel for when we come back together. And I look at my notes and I say, you said you were only going to smoke on the weekends. Now you told me you smoked on the week. I've changed my mind. But at least we're having a conversation about a person's own life, not a textbook. And you can talk about, well, you crossed this line, and then you crossed this line, and then you crossed this line. And maybe that draws them out to be able to connect the dots. And it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? It's a long game to have these conversations with young people.
So the families can actually take guidance from what you explained and being open to the communication rather than butting heads. Or, I see a lot of young people being rather abusive to their parents, obviously not physically, but, with their wordings. Obviously, you remember Dr. Powell, he would explain wonderfully that instead of butting heads, change the dance so they would be caught without guard and then they will fall into your arms and you can then start leading. So that's
right.
That's exactly what you're describing. Which signs people, family, cousins, aunts, uncles shall watch on a young who is going towards some sort of a psychosis? What would be the first signs? Because, I dealt with one. It's just, it's very difficult to understand nowadays what looks like a psychosis because, with the internet and with YouTube and so on and so forth, it's fine to believe in aliens. It's fine to think that they're flying cars. I mean, it's really, because I do believe in aliens. So
yes.
Where is that limit? Like, which would be the no sign, pay really attention, this is not going well?
The first thing that we look for if somebody is developing a psychotic disorder, schizophrenia or otherwise, is they don't seem to be themselves. There's a discontinuity. There's a change between what that person used to be like in their core, their personality, their activities, their way of social interaction. They're not right. They often draw inwards. They lose their ability gradually to have social interaction. Their range of emotional expression. They used to be a smiley person. Now they're not smiling as much. They used to be a person with a broad range of emotional interaction. It narrows. They tend to spend more time alone because they have this problem with the give and take of social interaction and they feel uncomfortable around other people. So that's one thing to look for. Another thing to look for is increasingly peculiar ideas. And you're right, it may be hard to distinguish from the latest meme going around the internet and the latest crazy fad. And part of that is preoccupation. So if someone not just is following the latest thing and excited about the latest picture that's circulating among their friends, but is with intent and with fervor and with preoccupation, increasingly concerned about minute details of some particular conspiracy, but especially one that they feel is scary to themselves and is impacting them, and the world is turning against them. That kind of paranoia or suspiciousness that is personalized, it can often be a sign. If we see a person's language and logic start to get garbled, they're not quite making sense. They can't articulate their thoughts as crisply. That could be thought disorder, which can be a feature of psychosis. And then as a more advanced symptom, if people seem to be responding to invisible stimuli, looking around, listening for a radio, that can be a sign of auditory hallucinations. But that's usually a later feature. The earliest feature is a intuitive sense, and parents are good at this. They have the radar, they have the antennae. Something's not right. They're not the same. They're narrowing their world in a way that I'm losing them.
I think that everybody can benefit from these guidances. It doesn't need to be your children, but your neighbor or someone that you're watching
That's
them
right.
and the behaviors are changing. We were able to establish, which is the most important, in my opinion, is that there is such a thing as cannabis use disorder. It's not harmless. One can be hooked on it, and they may end up going to a rehab or change their brain or change their life. It's something that one needs to pay attention as much as alcohol and other drugs.
Yes, I totally agree. And, there are some kids that will do so-called normative experimentation and not progress. But as we said, there's a substantial minority who do lose control, who do develop impairment, who do progress. And that, although overall rates of use may not be alarmingly higher, rates of high severity, high frequency use, outlier, seem to be increasing. And some of our research shows us the harms of, for example, that level of severity, daily cannabis use. Daily cannabis use under the age of 17, and Australia, they've done a lot of this nice work. In one Australian study, demonstrated a threefold increase in the high school dropout and an 18-fold increase in the rates of persistence of cannabis use disorder into adulthood, and an 8-fold increase in progression to other substance use disorders beyond cannabis. So just kind of a walk in the park there of a couple of statistics about some of the significant harms. There is such a thing, for sure, as cannabis use disorder, as cannabis addiction. It can progress. It can and often is a gateway to other substances, but even on its own, as you say, it's damaging to the adolescent and young adult mind and brain with impairment in psychosocial function. We want young people to blossom, discover their strengths, to be their best selves, and cannabis moves them in exactly the opposite direction.
Marc, that was a wonderful conversation. I mean, I learned a lot from you. I always did. And thank you so much for giving us this time.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's a pleasure to catch up again and to see you, and we'll talk soon.